stood against outlaws to defend an Apache maiden. The West never forgot what came next. The dust and the shadow. The air in Rattlesnake Gulch was perpetually thick with dust, the kind that tasted of dry earth and forgotten hopes. It clung to everything, the sun-bleached planks of the general store, the tarnished brass rail of the saloon, and the weathered faces of the men who drifted through its single, winding street. It was a town built on the promise of gold that had long since dwindled, leaving behind only the dregs of desperation and the occasional glint of violence. Silas Thorne knew dust. He'd known it for most of his 30-odd years, ever since he'd traded the fertile, settled lands of the East for the untamed, unforgiving expanse of the western frontier. He wasn't a prospector, nor a rancher, nor even a lawman in any official capacity. Silas was, for lack of a better term, a wanderer. A wanderer, a man whose past was as unreadable as the desert floor, etched only with faint, almost erased trails. He carried a Winchester, repeated with practiced ease, wore a worn leather duster that seemed to absorb the very grit of the landscape, and his eyes, a startling shade of gray, missed nothing. They held the quiet vigilance of a man who had seen too much and expected more. He had drifted into Rattlesnake Gulch 3 weeks prior, drawn by the rumor of odd jobs and the town's general anonymity. He'd taken to mending fences for Mrs. Albright, the taciturn widow who ran the boarding house, and fixing wagons for the perpetually drunk blacksmith, Jedidiah. His presence was tolerated, if not entirely welcomed. He was an outsider, and in Rattlesnake Gulch, outsiders were viewed with suspicion, unless they brought whiskey or gold. Silas brought neither, only a quiet competence that some found unsettling. The day it all began, the heat was particularly oppressive, even for late August. The sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, driving everyone indoors or into the sliver of shade offered by the sagging porch overhangs. Silas was painstakingly patching a leak in the saloon roof, the tar bubbling under the relentless glare, when the first hoofbeats echoed through the oppressive quiet. It wasn't the usual clip-clap of a lone rider or a small wagon. This was a thunder, a deliberate dead, ground-shaking approach that announced itself with chilling clarity. 6 riders, dust-caked and heavily armed, rode into town, their horses' hooves kicking up plumes of the ever-present dust. They were the Rattlesnake Gang, led by the notorious Blackbard Bellamy, a man whose smile was as deadly as his color but in Tuesday. Bellamy was a brute of a man, wide-shouldered and mean-eyed, with a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his jawline, a testament to past skirmishes. His gang, a collection of equally unsavory characters, bore names like Curly Joe, Spook, Daniels, and the hulking Grizz Olsen. They were known for their brutality, their disdain for law, and their particular cruelty towards anyone deemed other. The town instantly went silent. Doors slammed shut. Faces disappeared from windows. The saloon, which had been buzzing with the usual midday clientele, emptied faster than a shot glass. Bellamy dismounted first, his spurs jingling ominously on the boardwalk. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the deserted street, a predatory grin spreading across his face. He loved the fear he inspired. Silas, still on the roof, paused his work, his hand unconsciously dropping to the rifle slung across his back. He watched from the shadows, his expression unreadable. He'd seen men like Bellamy before, men who wielded fear like a weapon. He disliked them intensely. Then, from the direction of the livery stable, a figure emerged. She moved with a quiet grace that was utterly out of place in the grimy street. She was an Apache maiden, no older than 20, dressed in traditional buckskin, finely adorned with beads and quillwork. Her long dark hair, braided with leather and silver, cascaded down her back. Her face, framed by high cheekbones, was striking, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of caution and quiet defiance. She carried a single worn satchel, suggesting a long journey. Her name was Naye, and she was on her way to a mission further west, seeking passage to join her last remaining family members who had found refuge there. She had stopped in Rattlesnake Gulch, only to rest her horse and gather some provisions, hoping to pass through unnoticed. But in Rattlesnake Gulch, a lone Apache woman was as conspicuous as a desert flower. Black Bart, Bellamy's eyes, having scoured the empty street, now fixed on Naye, his grin widened, transforming into something lecherous and cruel. Well, well, what do we have here, boys? A droll. His voice a gravelly laugh that carried clearly in the stillness. Looks like the desert's decided to offer us a little refreshment. Curly Joe, a sneering man with a twitchy trigger finger, let out a hoot. A little red-skinned squaw, all alone. Looks like our luck's turned, Bart. Naye froze, ergase meeting Bellamy's. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, ancient weariness, a recognition of the danger that predatory men pose to women like her. She took a small, almost imperceptible step backward, her hand instinctively going to the small, ornate knife tucked into her belt. Bellamy saw the movement. Feisty, ain't she? He chuckled, taking a step towards her. His men dismounted, forming a loose, menacing semicircle. The air crackled with unspoken menace. The silence from the town was absolute, deafening. Not a single soul emerged. Not a single voice was raised in protest. Fear was a powerful muscle. Silas watched from the roof, his jaw tightening. He saw the cold calculation in Bellamy's eyes, the casual cruelty of his men. He saw Naye's quiet strength, her prepared resignation. It was a scene he had witnessed variations of before, in different towns, with different victims. Each time he had walked away. Each time a piece of him had withered. This time something was different. Perhaps it was the sheer vulnerability of the maiden, her solitary courage against overwhelming odds. Perhaps it was the chilling indifference of the town, a town that would rather hide than stand for basic decency. Or perhaps it was the ghost of his own past, whispering secrets he had long tried to bury. A memory of a promise made, a vow broken, a moment of inaction that had haunted him for years. He saw Bellamy reach for Naye, his calloused hand stretching towards her. Naye flinched, pulling her knife, a desperate, futile gesture. It was a flash of silver against the drab background of the street. Silas's decision was made not with a grand thought, but with an instinct as old as the hills around them. His hand gripped the smooth, cold wood of his Winchester. It took a breath, the dust filling his lungs, and in that moment, the dust and the shadow that had defined him began to shift. He was no longer just a wanderer. He was a man with a choice. The West was a harsh land, and justice often came in unexpected forms. What do you think motivated Silas Thorne to make his stand? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The desert wind, usually a mournful sigh, seemed to hold its breath. Black Bart Bellamy's hand was mere inches from Naye, his eyes gleaming with anticipation, when a voice, calm and steady, cut through the tense stillness of Rattlesnake Gulch. Leave her be. Bellamy paused, his hand dropping slightly. He turned slowly, his cruel grin not quite fading, but morphing into a look of irritation. His eyes scanned the deserted street, then lifted to the saloon roof. Silas Thor stood silhouetted against the blinding sun, his rifle now held loosely, casually, in his hands, pointing neither up nor down, but simply present. A silent declaration. Bellamy scoffed. Well, looky here, boys. Looks like the roof mender fancies himself a hero. He squinted. You got a name, friend? Silas Thorne replied, his voice devoid of inflection, yet carrying a resonance that made even Bellamy's men shift uneasily. Silas, Bellamy repeated, tasting the name. Silas, you got a say in this, do you? This here squaw ain't none of your concern. She's just a piece of property in a land reclaimed. Property don't fight back with a knife. Silas stated, his gaze unwavering. He gestured subtly with the rifle. And I don't like bullies. The air went dead silent again. The audacity of the statement, delivered with such quiet authority, was like a stone dropped into a still pond. Bellamy's face contorted, his good humor evaporating. He wasn't used to being defied, especially not by a lone man, a stranger, and certainly not over an Apache woman. You got some sand, Silas. Bellamy snarled, his hand hovering over the butt of his pistol. But sand gets kicked around. My advice? Get back to fixing roofs before you find yourself fixing a hole in your head. My advice? Silas countered, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in his voice. There was not fear but a coiled tension, like a ruthless snake preparing to strike. Walk away, and take your mangy dogs with you. Bellamy's eyes narrowed to slits. You just bought yourself a ticket to hell, roof mender. In that instant, everything happened at once. Bellamy, fast as a snake, drew his Colt, but Silas was faster. The Winchester barked, a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding hills, not at Bellamy, but at the ground directly in front of him, kicking up a spray of dust and gravel. The impact made the Bellamy stumble back a step, momentarily disoriented. Next one's for your kneecap, Bart, Silas announced, his voice still level but now laced with an undeniable edge of steel. Curly Joe, reacting to the shot, drew his own pistol, but before he could raise it, Silas had already shifted his aim. The Winchester roared again, and Curly Joe cried out, clutching his shoulder. A dark stain spread rapidly across his shirt. He dropped his gun, collapsing to the dusty street. The other outlaws, momentarily stunned by Silas's speed and accuracies, hesitated. They were a gang, yes, but they relied on numbers and intimidation, not necessarily superior gunplay. Silas had just demonstrated a level of skill that unnerved them. Anyone else feel lucky? Silas challenged, his rifle sweeping across them, lingering on each man for a fraction of a second. Grease Olson, the hulking brute, snarled and lunged for his weapon. He was big, but slow. Silas fired a third shot, disabling the man's gun hand. Olson roared in pain, dropping his pistol, his fingers mangled. 3 shots, 3 direct hits, all designed to incapacitate, not kill, but clearly demonstrating Silas's deadly intent. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the sudden chilling realization that this was no ordinary drifter. Bellamy, having recovered, glowered at his wounded men, then back at Silas. He was outnumbered, but Silas had the high ground and the lethal advantage. He weighed his options, his anger battling with a shrewd understanding of survival. He wasn't going to risk his life over a woman, not when he could simply retreat and plan his revenge. You're a dead man, Silas, Bellamy bellowed, his voice filled with venom. You hear me? You're a dead man walking. No one crosses Black Bart Bellamy and leaves. He glared at Naye, then spat on the ground. This ain't over, squaw, and it ain't over for you too, Silas. The West is wide, but it ain't wide enough for you to hide from me. With it, Bellamy mounted his horse, motioning for his remaining unwounded men to help Curly Joe and Grease Olson. The gang, their bravado shattered, scrambled onto their horses, leaving a trail of curses and dust as they galloped out of town. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. The townspeople, slowly, cautiously, began to peek out from behind closed doors and drawn curtains. They saw Silas, still on the roof, his rifle now resting by his side, and they saw Naye, standing exactly where she had been, her dark eyes fixed on Silas with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Silas slowly descended the ladder, his boots hitting the boardwalk with a soft thud. He walked towards Naye, his gaze sweeping the now visible faces of the townspeople, challenging them to break their silence. Not one met his eye. Are you all right? Silas asked Naye, his voice softer now. Naye nodded slowly, her hand still resting on her knife. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Why?" she asked, her voice a low murmur, barely audible. "Why did you do this?" Silas shrugged. A slight, almost imperceptible movement. "Didn't seem right," he said, his gaze drifting to the fleeing dust cloud of the rattlesnake gang. No one deserves to be treated like that. He knew his simple explanation wouldn't suffice. There was a deeper current to his actions, a personal reckoning he wasn't ready to articulate. He had intervened, not just to protect her, but to exorcise a ghost of his own. The ghost of a young woman he hadn't protected years ago, a memory that still burned. The town, however, didn't see a man grappling with his past. They saw a quiet drifter who had just single-handedly defied the most feared outlaw gang in the territory. They saw a hero or a fool, and as they watched him walk away with the Apache maiden, a ripple of unease, mingled with a grudging respect, began to spread through Rattlesnake Gulch. The fuse had been lit, and everyone knew that Black Bart Bellamy would not let this insult pass. The West, in its vastness, had just borne witness to a moment that would etch itself into its unforgiving memory. Silas's stand was a clear act of defiance against a powerful force. How do you think the townsfolk should react to his heroism, and what responsibilities do you believe they now have? Join the discussion below. The immediate aftermath of Silas Thorne's stand in Rattlesnake Gulch was a fragile, uneasy quiet. The dust of the Rattlesnake gang's retreat had barely settled before the town, which had held its breath, exhaled in a cacophony of whispers and hushed conversations. Silas, however, paid them no mind. His attention was solely on Naye. "They'll be back," she stated, her voice calm, devoid of panic, as she watched the distant dust cloud. She was a woman of the desert, accustomed to reading signs, and the raw fury etched on Black Bart Bellamy's face was as clear a warning as any. "I know," Silas replied. "His gas is sweeping the empty street, which means we don't have much time." His words were prophetic. Within hours, the initial relief in Rattlesnake Gulch gave way to fear, and fear, as it often does, curdled into resentment. Jedediah the blacksmith was the first to approach Silas, his face pale and his hands shaking. "Silas, what in tarnation did you do?" he stammered, his eyes darting nervously towards the road the gang had taken. "Bellamy ain't gonna forget this. He's gonna burn this town to the ground." "I was going to hurt her," Jedediah, Silas said, his voice flat. "She ain't one of us." Jedediah cried, gesturing vaguely towards Naye, who stood a little apart, observing the exchange with quiet dignity. "She's an Apache. They got their own kind to worry about. You don't put a target on all our backs for a redskin." Others joined in, their voices growing bolder, fueled by a mixture of fear and the ever-present prejudice of the era. "He's right, Silas. You ought to let her be. Now we all pay the price. Get her out of here. And you with her. We don't want trouble." Silas looked at their faces, a mixture of cowardice and ingrained hatred. He felt a familiar weariness settle over him, the weight of a world unwilling to see beyond its own narrow fears. They had not expected thanks, but this raw animosity, this swift turning of blame, still pricked at him. "You think running her off will save you?" Silas challenged, his voice quiet but sharp. "Bellamy will still come back. He'll come back because you let him get away with it. You showed him he can do whatever he wants here." His words struck a nerve, but the fear was too deep-seated. The town elders, led by the prosperous but spineless store owner, Mr. Abernathy, delivered their ultimatum. "Silas, we appreciate you saving us trouble, but we can't afford a war with the Bellamy. You and the girl, you need to move on. Tonight." Silas didn't argue. He knew that reasoning with fear was often futile. He simply nodded, his jaw tight. He would not abandon Naye now, especially not after what he had done. "Is principle," His brief moment of courage had set them on a new, dangerous path together. That evening, as the last rays of sun bled across the horizon, Silas and Naye packed what little they had. Silas bought what provisions he could with the meager earnings from his odd jobs, and Naye produced a small pouch of silver coins, enough to buy them a sturdy pack horse and a few extra supplies. "From my people," she explained, her gaze meeting his, "for passage to the mission." They rode out of Rattlesnake Gulch under the cover of dusk, leaving behind a town that had traded its conscience for a fleeting, false sense of security. As they rode, the whispers of the townspeople seemed to follow them, a mix of relief and resentment. Their journey was arduous. Silas, skilled in tracking and survival, led them westward, away from the established trails, deeper into the rugged, unforgiving landscape. Naye, surprisingly resilient, proved to be an invaluable companion. She knew the desert in ways he couldn't comprehend, identifying inedible plants, finding hidden water sources, and reading the signs of the land with an uncanny intuition. They traveled by night when the desert was cool and silent, resting during the day in hidden alcoves and dry washes. They knew Bellamy would be hunting them. He was a man of his word when it came to revenge. And indeed, the shadow of Bellamy was never far. Twice, Silas spotted signs of trackers, a broken twig, a disturbed stone, confirming their pursuit. It pushed their small party harder, always aware of the unseen eyes that might be watching. During one particularly tense night, huddled by a small, smokeless fire, Naye spoke, her voice soft against the vast silence. "You risked everything for me. You did not have to." Silas stared into the embers. "Maybe I did," he confessed, a ray glimpse into his guarded past. "There was a time, a long time ago, I didn't stand up. A woman, she paid the price for my inaction. I promised myself I wouldn't let it happen again." Naye listened, her dark eyes understanding. She didn't press for details. The West was full of ghosts, and every man carried his own. "My people say," Naye began, "that when one takes a stand for what is right, even if it is against a great wind, the wind remembers, the earth remembers. And those who hide in the shadows, they too remember what they saw, and what they did not do." Her words resonated with Silas. He wasn't just running from Bellamy. He was carrying the burden of a principle, a quiet defiance that had separated him from the cowardly town. The stakes were no longer just their lives, but the very meaning of the stand he had taken. Bellamy, meanwhile, was not idle. His pride wounded, his authority challenged. He rallied his gang, now more vicious and determined than ever. He spread the word that Silas Thorne, the Indian lover, was a marked man, offering a bounty for his capture, dead or alive. The tale of his defiance in Rattlesnake Gulch, twisted and embellished, began to spread, reaching the ears of bounty hunters, opportunistic drifters, and even other outlaw gangs, eager to prove their mettle against the man who had humbled Bellamy. Silas and Naye were no longer just two individuals escaping danger. They had become symbols. To Bellamy, Silas was a personal insult, a challenge to his reign. To the wider, prejudiced West, Silas was an anomaly, a man who chose an Apache woman over his own kind, and therefore a man deserving of scorn. But to a select few, to those who still believed in a fundamental rightness, Silas Thorne was becoming something else entirely, a legend in the making. The whispers had begun, and the stage was being set for a confrontation that the West would indeed never forget. Silas's choice to defend Naye came with a heavy cost. Do you believe personal conviction is worth sacrificing everything for in a brutal world? Share your perspective in the comments. Your insights enrich our understanding of these characters and their struggles. The chase lasted for weeks. Silas and Naye moved like phantoms across the unforgiving landscape of New Mexico territory. Two specks of defiance against the vast indifference of the desert and the relentless pursuit of Black Bar Bellamy. Silas relied on his formidable tracking skills, his knowledge of the terrain, and a growing, almost primal intuition. Naye, with her intimate understanding of the Apache ancestor lands, proved to be not just a guide, but a partner in survival. She showed him how to move through the arroyos unseen, how to draw water from seemingly dry riverbeds, and how to use the desert's sparse vegetation for cover. Their bond, forged in the crucible of shared danger, deepened with every mile. Bellamy, however, was equally relentless. He had gathered a larger force, fueled by vengeance and the promise of a bounty. His men, hardened by the chase, were growing desperate, their frustration turning into savage cruelty. They left a trail of violence in their wake, harassing isolated homesteads and small settlements, demanding information about the Indian lover and his Apache companion. The news of their pursuit spread like wildfire, painting Silas as an outcast and Naye as his accomplice in some unnamed crime. The climactic confrontation came not in a bustling town or a dramatic canyon, but on a desolate wind-swept mesa known to the Apache as Spirit's Rest, a place of ancient power and stark beauty. Silas had chosen it for its tactical advantages, a single steep approach, defensively high ground, and a clear line of sight for miles. He knew they couldn't outrun Bellamy forever. It was time to make their final stand. They spent 2 days preparing. Silas fortified their position with loose rocks, creating makeshift barricades. Naye, with uncanny foresight, found a small hidden spring on the mesa's eastern slope, ensuring they had water. They rationed their dwindling ammunition, knowing every shot had to count. As the sun began its slow descent on the 3rd day, a distant dust cloud appeared on the horizon, growing steadily larger. Bellamy and his men had found them. There were at least a dozen riders, a formidable force against Silas's lone rifle and Naye's quiet resolve. "This is it," Silas murmured, checking the action of his Winchester. His face was grim, but his eyes held a steely glint. Naye nodded, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "My ancestors will watch," she said, her voice a soft assurance. "They will know what you do." The gang advanced, riding hard, their shouts and curses carrying on the wind. Bellamy at the front looked like a figure of dark vengeance, his scar prominent, his eyes burning with hatred. He wanted Silas dead, and he wanted it to be slow. "Thorn, you hear me, you yellow-bellied coward?" Bellamy bellowed, his voice echoing across the mesa. "Come out and face me. You think you can hide up there with your red-skin whore? I'm gonna hang you both from the highest piñon." Silas didn't answer with words. He answered with a shot. The Winchester cracked, and the lead rider, one of Bellamy's most loyal henchmen, pitched forward from his saddle, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The gang halted, momentarily thrown into disarray. They had underestimated Silas's marksmanship, his ability to hit a moving target at such a distance. They dismounted and began their slow, cautious ascent, fanning out, using the sparse cover of rocks and scrub. The battle for Spirit's Rest was brutal and relentless. Silas, fighting with deadly precision, picked off 2 more of Bellamy's men as they tried to flank their position. Naye, a silent shadow, moved with astonishing agility, using her knowledge of the terrain to draw attention, to distract, and occasionally to use her knife in close quarters, a blur of buckskin and steel. Hours passed. The sun set, casting long, purple shadows, then gave way to the pale moonlight. The battle continued, a deadly dance of shadows and gunfire. Silas took a bullet grazed to his arm, but ignored the pain, his focus absolute. He was fighting not just for his life, but for the principle he had upheld, for the dignity he had defended. Finally, only Bellamy and 2 of his remaining men remained. They made a desperate charge, knowing their numbers were dwindling, their hope of victory fading. Silas met them with unwavering resolve. "Take us," one man from his saddle, then engaged the other in a desperate hand-to-hand struggle, ending it with a swift, brutal strike. Only Bell remained. They faced Silas across the blood-stained rocks, both men breathing heavily, exhausted, but their hatred burning brightly. "You won't win, Thorn," Bellamy rasped, drawing his final pistol. "No one stands up for an Indian and gets away with it in this West. You'll be forgotten." "Some things," Silas said, his voice raw, "are worth remembering." Their final duel was swift. Bellamy fired first, his shot going wide. Silas, moving with a weary precision, squeezed the trigger of his Winchester. The bullet struck Bellamy squarely in the chest. Black Bart Bellamy, the fear outlaw, crumpled to the ground, his reign of terror finally over. Silence fell upon Spirit's Rest, broken only by the wind and their ragged breaths. Silas stood over Bellamy's body, his rifle smoking, his body aching, but his spirit unbroken. Naye came to his side, her hand gently touching his wounded arm. They buried Bellamy and his men there, beneath the silent gaze of the Mesa. The West would remember this day. Silas and Naye continued their journey. She eventually reached her mission, but she never forgot the man who stood for her. She told her story to her people, to the missionaries, and later to historians who would document the shifting sands of the frontier. The tale of Silas Thorn spread across the West like the wind. It was told in saloons and around campfires, a true story that quickly morphed into legend, not just of a gunfighter, but of a man who chose righteousness over racial prejudice, of courage against overwhelming odds, of a stand taken when everyone else hid. Rattlesnake Gulch never truly recovered from its shame. The townsfolk were haunted by their inaction, by the memory of the drifter who had done what they dared not. The fear of Bellamy was replaced by the uncomfortable truth of their own cowardice. Some lived, unable to bear the quiet judgment that settled over the town. Others tried to change, to be better, but the stain of that day remained. Silas Thorn, however, did not become a static legend. He continued to wander, but his wanderings were now imbued with a purpose, a reputation that preceded him. He became known as the Sentinel of the Silent, a man who would appear wherever injustice festered, wherever the weak were preyed upon. He never sought fame, only balance. The West never forgot what came next, the legend of Silas Thorn, the quiet man who in a dusty, forgotten town chose to defend an Apache maiden against a notorious outlaw gang. His act sparked a conflict that tore through the territory, leaving a trail of blood and shattered reputations, but ultimately forging a new kind of hero, one whose courage was measured not just by the speed of his draw, but by the strength of his moral compass. He proved that even in the most brutal of lands, honor could bloom, and a single stand could echo across generations, forever altering the landscape of justice and memory. Silas Thorn's story became a legend that shaped the West. What lasting impact do you think such acts of courage have on society, even today? Your thoughtful reflections are deeply valued.